are these people?
So I mentioned this last week because I've noticed, we hear a lot of, we need a two-state solution. We need a two-state solution. We need a two-state solution over the last year in particular. And I don't hear anyone talking about what that is in terms of what that means for Israel and Palestine. I really haven't heard a breakdown of what that entails in mainstream media. And I'm honestly a little bit more surprised that people in independent media in our space haven't really talked about this much, if at all. Now, I could be wrong. If they have, let me know. But as far as I know, within the last year, I haven't really seen any of our comrades talk more about this in terms of what the implication is in Israel and Palestine. So I figured I'm going to do it. But I think obviously this is a loaded issue. I think this might be probably the beginning of maybe a series where potentially we can talk a little bit more about this. So if you're interested in that, or if you want to kind of go on a deep dive with me in terms of that, let me know in the chat, or let me know in the comments if you're watching this stream afterward. But I think at least for tonight, I think we'll just kind of get our feet wet in terms of what the two-state solution is, just to kind of give a little bit of an overview and why, according to many people, that is actually not a good thing or even the best thing that should be happening in terms of, what as a way to kind of solve this conflict among Israelis and Palestinians. So we're going to look at a clip from RTE News that based in Ireland that gives a few minutes explanation as to what it is and why it's not a good thing. And then we're going to elaborate it a little bit more. So Indie, when you're ready, you can go ahead and play the clip.
Depending on who you ask, the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is either a pipe dream or the only viable way forward.
As we look to the future, the only real solution to the situation is a two-state solution over time.
But before we get to why that's the case, let's take a step back. What actually is the two-state solution? On one level, the idea behind it is simple. A Palestinian state would be created alongside Israel. Israelis and Palestinians would live alongside each other in their own sovereign countries, in two states. The problem is that prior to the current phase of the conflict, the two-state solution was basically considered dead in the water. The last major push for a two-state solution came when Barack Obama was the US president. But by the end of his term, he said that Israeli actions in the occupied West Bank had made it almost impossible. He was referring to the building of illegal Israeli settlements there. How can Palestinians establish their own state if Israel has illegally built towns, villages, and even cities in much of their territory? Israel's far-right and ultra-nationalist government has rapidly increased settlement building there in the past year or so. The rise of those ultra-nationalists in Israeli politics is the second major problem. They staunchly oppose Palestinian statehood, they believe the West Bank should be annexed by Israel altogether, and they would never support the dismantling of Israeli settlements there. But there are also problems and divisions on the Palestinian side. Hamas has recently dismissed the idea of a two-state solution, and it does not see eye to eye with the Palestinian Authority, which controls the occupied West Bank. At the same time, younger Palestinians have lost faith in the authorities' attempts to end the conflict with negotiations. But even if you were to sweep those problems aside, there are four key areas of contention that have served as roadblocks over the decades. The first one relates to borders. Neither side has been able to agree about where to draw the lines between Israel and Palestine. Most people argue that there should be a return to the borders that existed before 1967, when Israel first occupied Gaza and the West Bank. But there is also the notion of land swaps. Israel could keep some of its settlements in exchange for other land that it would give to Palestinians. The second roadblock is Jerusalem. Both sides claim the Holy City as their capital. For Muslims, it's home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, where the Prophet Muhammad is thought to have ascended to heaven. And it is the holiest city in Judaism and given special status in Jewish religious law. Israel currently controls the entire city, but the two-state solution would likely involve dividing it into an Israeli West and a Palestinian East. The third roadblock is the right of return. Over 700,000 Palestinians either fled in terror or were expelled from their homes when Israel was established in 1948. Their descendants, which now number in the millions, want the right to return to their homes in Israeli territory. But that would be a problem for Israel, which wants to maintain a Jewish majority. The final hurdle is about security. The Palestinians want the Israeli military to withdraw entirely from their territory. But in the wake of the October 7th Hamas massacre, it's even harder to imagine that Israel would agree to that. So why is everyone talking about the two-state solution again? For many, it's the best solution there is, and they hope that if and when more moderate leaders come into power in Israel, it will be firmly back on the table.
Yeah. So I think
Depending on
basically
who
the
you ask,
idea.
the two-state solution.
Sorry. I think basically the idea. So based on the clip of a two-state solution is that the hope is eventually someone who's more, I guess, to the center would eventually come into power, which I'm like, when is that going to happen? Who will essentially be for it. So, but it's funny that, Kamala Harris is kind of calling for a two-state solution when BB himself has said that's a non-starter for me. And she keeps saying it, and even in independent media, they're not challenging her and saying that, well, so what's your plan to get him there? They never go into that. So I think that's kind of interesting that that's kind of like a failed attempt on our media to challenge Kamala and, well, Biden's on his way out, but Harris to be like, well, BB is not for it. What's your plan to get him there? And they don't ask her that, and she's not going to have a great answer anyway. But anyway, so I found this article from Foreign Policy. Actually, I've used them a few times before, but I think this is a decent article that kind of talks about why the two-state solution is actually shit. But then I think what I like about it is that, we can use history and actually use other countries that essentially kind of developed out of this idea too, and look what happened to them. So this article is written by, hold on, let me pull this up. Manlio Graziano, where he writes, the two-state solution is a recipe for carnage. Washington's favorite prescription for Israeli-Palestinian peace risks unleashing a wave of inter-ethnic violence unseen since the partition of India and Pakistan. So he writes, since the Israeli-Hamas war erupted in Gaza, leaders of the great and middle powers not directly involved in the armed conflict have consistently stated that the only way out is to create two states, one for the Israelis and another for the Palestinians. U.S. President Joe Biden has made this idea the mantra of the strained relationship with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, leaders worldwide, including Chinese President Xi Jinping, Russian President Vladimir Putin, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, French President Emmanuel Macron, U.S. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman have echoed this idea. The choir was, and still is, so ununanimous that Netanyahu's explicit rejection of the two-state solution last month has sparked widespread expressions of apparent surprise and even outrage. Oh, by the way, this article was written back in February of this year. However, such reactions are themselves surprising. The Israeli Prime Minister could be charged with various misdeeds, but no one can accuse him of inconsistently regarding a position that he has steadily upheld since the signing of the first Oslo Accord in 1993. But at that time, the Israeli parliament narrowly approved the Oslo Accords after a bitter debate and faced eruptions of violence, the most famous victim of which was Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, killed by Jewish extremists in 1995. But the undeniable sign that the political will to create two states was lacking was the exponential growth of the colonization of the West Bank. More than 3/4 of today's settlers have arrived since the Oslo Accords, progressively reducing areas A and B, inhabited by Palestinians and partially controlled by the Palestinian Authority, to a shrinking arpeggio of enclaves, surrounded by the Sea of Area C under exclusive Israeli control and forbidden to Palestinians. Meanwhile, none of the Arab and Muslim countries that have built their legitimacy by supposedly supporting the Palestinian cause since 1948 could afford for that cause to disappear. In short, the so-called two-state solution did not die in a failed attempt to implement it. It was stillborn, and it never was a solution. So the unanimity in which world leaders today insist on reviving it is striking. Usually when great and middle powers make a show of unanimity, it is because they either have little or no interest at stake, or they are powerless to do anything. They are thus free to make principled proposals that, however impractical, have the virtue of appearing simple, understandable, and reasonable.
It's unanimity. Unity!
Yeah. In the present case, global and regional powers have huge interests at stake, as disruptions to shipping in the Red Sea and a growing risk of a major regional war show, suggesting that they simply don't know what else to do. The United States seems cornered to the point of being unable to compel Israel to comply. China and Russia, each with varying degrees of involvement and interest, appear to be capitalizing on the situation by twisting the knife in the U.S. wound. Local sponsors of the Palestinian cause wish for the cause to persist, and Europe, including Britain, has nothing to say because, since the Oslo Accords, it has been sidelined from the equation. The undeniable reality that the more powerless that Washington appears, the more proactive the conflict is likely to be, and this presents a global danger with the potential for increased international disorder, which we're beginning to see right now. In this context, the relenting appeal for the two-state solution is alarming for two reasons. First, because of the two-state hypothesis triumphantly lodged by the United States more than 3 decades ago, has long been considered dead and buried, and exhuming its corpse now highlights the inability of world leaders to propose and impose a more credible response. So in other words, they're being lazy as shit. Second, and far more worryingly, the two-state solution, were it ever to be imposed, would certainly result in a new Nakba, or catastrophe, that would make the 1948 Nakba and the one occurring today appear minor in comparison. It would be a catastrophe this time, not only for the Palestinians, but also for the Israelis and for the entire Middle East. History provides us with eloquent and bloody examples to support this.
Mm-hmm.
Ever since nationhood became a political goal in the 19th century, the romantic dream has always translated into a nightmare marked by forced assimilation or ethnic cleansing. And actually, shout out to Due Distance. I think they brought up a good point over a tweet. I think I watched them over the weekend where I believe Keaton or Russell mentioned this, that our countries currently have basically been built upon carnage. So the idea that Israel has a right to defend, first of all, countries don't have rights. People do, but countries in of itself has rights. And then the argument is countries are what they are now due to, exploitation and colonization. Case in point, look at this country, how it became a country. So, but I think it's the idea of like to create a nation usually always means assimilation and killing off of local populations that live there. And we've seen this time and time again in history. So so they mentioned that. So I thought that was a good point in terms of thinking about this in terms of what's happening in Israel right now. But I digress. Almost always state apparatuses, private militias, or even willing and improvised executioners have taken this process upon themselves. For the Russian Jews starting at around 1881 to Neymar's Rajinja in 2017, the belief that others, quote unquote, with a different language or religion, have no right to remain on our lands has left behind a long trail of blood that continues to lengthen before it has even had time to clot. While there have been instances where the division of two communities into separate states stemmed from a deliberate political choice, hardly any of them can be equated to the current situation between the Palestinians and Israelis. This is mainly true because such decisions almost always apply to situations where ethnic cleansing had already occurred, either entirely, such as Cyprus in 1974 and Kosovo in 1999, or partially, as in the case of Greece and Turkey in 1922. The only comparable case to the scenario that many wish for Israelis and Palestinians today is the partition of India. The short-sighted British decision to divide Muslims and Hindus in 1947 demonstrates that thus planning the creation of two contiguous states for populations that had coexisted for decades or centuries inevitably needs to carnage on a colossal scale. The number of people slaughtered or expelled at the time of the creation of the Indian Union and Pakistan is literally incalculable. After the Punjab, a relatively linguistic homogeneous region, but one that was home to four major religions, was suddenly split in half between India and Pakistan. Some 6.5 million Muslims and 4.7 million Hindus and Sikhs were thrown out, and intercommunal butchery saw the slaughter of what is estimated to be between 500,000, according to the province's governor, and 800,000 people, as the British High Commissioners in Karachi estimated, out of a total population of less than 35 million. In Delhi, between 20,000 and 25,000 Muslims were killed, largely by Hindu and Sikh refugees who had fled Pakistan, and the Muslim share of the population fell from 1/3 in 1941 to 5% in 1951. The total number of murders, rapes, and other violent attacks, or of refugees forced to leave their homes, have never been accounted for, neither because Indians nor Pakistanis want to acknowledge that their countries were born out of a bloodbath, much less to acknowledge their own responsibility in that carnage.
Let alone Kashmir, the middle region between them, that, you know, this no man's land that, you know, they want to be their own country. I don't know, but anyway.
Yeah, so basically, you know, hot mess all around. In trying to divide India off. So, but again, besides the immense humanitarian catastrophe, the case of the 1947 partition also foreshadows the inevitable long-term fate that awaits two states separated by a bloody border. For the 3/4 of a century since then, India and Pakistan have cultivated a hostility punctuated by periodic clashes, terror attacks, and at least 4 official wars, exploited and exacerbated by the great powers for their own games on the international chessboard. And were a two-state solution somehow applied to formally create the state of Palestine, it could have even more serious consequences than the Indian case. In India, there was not, as there is today in the Middle East, such a long history of hostility and even mutual hatred, nurtured for decades and fueled by expulsions, deportations, humiliation, racism, revenge, indiscriminate acts of terrorism, and shameless historical falsifications, all multiplied by the exploitation of tensions by local and international powers and a growing internal tribalism within the two camps.
Wait a minute, I didn't see the word occupation anywhere in there. How about that? Yeah. I find that interesting. You know, look, foreign policy is a little on the neo-libby, on the more establishment-leaning side, so they're not going to do that. But again, there wasn't that. There kind of was a hatred between India and Pakistan, but the other problem is that they allowed India and Pakistan to both have their own militaries and their own governments, and that's not what they're talking about here. And I don't know if the article is actually going to get into that, but let's go.
Well, yeah. When political tensions erupted in Dhaka, Bangladesh, recalls Amata Sen, then a teenager, peaceful citizens who had for years lived together in the same neighborhoods and buildings, rendering each other visits and favors, discovered that they now exclusively Hindus or Muslims and then turned into dedicated thugs, murdering each other on behalf of what they respectively called our people, he wrote in his book Identity and Violence. In the Middle East, a climate conducive to assassinations on behalf of what the killers call our people has been prepared and practiced for 75 years. The horrors of the recent months have acted somehow as a catalyst for this entire history, shattering the remaining taboos. From the October 7th, 2023 program, reminiscent in brutality to Germany's Kristallnacht of 1948, to Israel's indiscriminate retaliation against the people of Gaza, from the increasingly explicit provocations of an exclusive supposed divine right of Jews over the entire land, to the resurgence of the Palestinian demand for the expulsion of all Jews from the region.
Wait, I haven't heard that. I haven't heard all Jews from the region. The occupiers, if you want to live there in peace in a single kind of secular, non-secular state, that's one thing that I've heard. I've never heard them say, and they changed that directive. Even Hamas in 2018 changed their charter.
Right. It would be naive, to say the least, to hope that Arabs with Israeli citizenship in such a climate would be allowed to remain peacefully in an ethnically pure Israel, and that Jewish settlers would be allowed to remain peacefully in an ethnically pure West Bank. Moreover, the density of the Israeli presence in the West Bank and the military protection that is offered to the settlers leaves no doubt as to the frightening dimensions that intercommunal carnage could take. The peaceful coexistence of two states born into such an ocean of blood would be unimaginable, and Israel would definitely cease to be the safe haven for the world's Jews that the fathers of Zionism had dreamed of.
Yeah, well, the fathers of Zionism are not just Jews, by the way. Let's refer back to the INN news segment of the Christian Zionists and how Zionism was started largely by Christians, and there are more American Christian Zionists than there are Zionist Jews in the entire world.
Right. In fact, and you can vouch for this, is that many Jews, when the idea of Zionism began to come in vogue somewhat, many Jews, like just normal people, were against it.
Albert Einstein rejected it.
Right. Because it was built on the idea of exploitation, which, again, that's not in relation to, well, shouldn't be in relation to any religion at all. So,
well, it also goes against the Torah in a lot of ways. Because supposedly it's not supposed to be handed to us by other non-Jewish owning countries and say, here, this belongs to you. Like, the whole thing is just it's so twisted. 1899, they had already started. Balfour Declaration. We've done extensive INN news segments on this. Reef and Collin. We've even done live streams about this, and done clip shows that put all this together kind of in chronological order, so you can kind of really get a feel for the history of the region and the fact that this didn't start on October 7th. It didn't start in 1967. It didn't even start in 1948.
1948. No.
Okay. It started in the late 1800s, if not before that even. I'm sure, if you can go back and find the records, but there was a Zionist Congress that met very famously in 1899, I think in 1898 as well. And they had this plan to take over Palestine.
Right.
So,
to assert that a partition of Israel and Palestine today could represent a model of a peaceful exchange of populations is either impudent cynicism or, more simply, a stark display of ignorance, not only because the byproduct of past partitions was the massacre of hundreds of thousands of people, but also because the population exchanges themselves led to the deaths of numerous refugees. Beyond the toll of death and destruction, one must remember that ethnic cleansing has always impoverished the countries involved, stripping them of irreplaceable human resources. The expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain around the 16th century triggered a prolonged economic crisis believed by some to be connected to the country's subsequent decline. During the formation of so-called nation states, instances such as ethnic self-mutilation almost became commonplace. The Armenians, Greeks, and Jews, all pillars of the Ottoman Empire for centuries, were almost entirely removed from Turkish territory between 1915 and 1922, as was the Muslim population of the Balkans between 1878 and 1913. After 1945, 13 million Germans were expelled from Central and Eastern Europe, all of them carried out under the deceptive idea of establishing perpetually nation states. The tragedy in which Israelis and Palestinians are imprisoned today is exacerbated by the fact that the only solution that external actors have proposed would simply make their situation worse, plunging them into what philosopher Thomas Hobbes called the state of nature, that is, a permanent war for every man against every man. It remains perplexing why other potential solutions, which do exist, are neither explored nor considered. To be sure, none of these alternatives, from confederations to single-state models, could be easily implemented. All are exceedingly challenging, require long-term commitment, and entail concessions that both the Israeli and Palestinian leaderships are presently unwilling or unable to make. But the same challenges loom over the two-state solution, and it risks resulting in considerable more disastrous consequences both in the immediate and in the foreseeable future. In the name of a better future for Israelis and Palestinians, or at least one that is less bad, the idea of a two-state solution should be withdrawn once and for all from the vocabulary of Middle East politics and buried in the archives of the worst and most dangerous political gimmicks of all time.
Yeah.
So,
no argument there.
Right. So you're right. It's very Libby, and it doesn't even get to, like the colonization slash like exploitation of Palestinians. But I do feel that the author here made some great points in terms of, but then also kind of using like India and Pakistan as an example of what essentially happened to them and how it would be a lot worse if Israel but I think just based on the idea that there's been this tension between Arabs and Israelis for centuries now, like within the last century now, and we've talked about how, Israelis have been propagandized essentially to hate Arabs, and Arabs in turn have responded in, well, you don't like in turn due to the oppression that they've been feeling. So to let that go from either side at this point, I think will be extremely difficult. And honestly, like even a secular state idea, which I agree would be a lot more complex, even that to me is also to me not feasible. Like, just take me as a Black man living here. Now, granted, I'm an immigrant, but are Black people truly free in this country? No. Yes, we may have more rights than probably, our parents and grandparents and ancestors back, being, forced into slavery here and in the West in general. But in terms of having true liberation, that's still something that we've been, at least for me, I've been kind of mentioning online, and no one gives a damn. But so yeah, it gives the illusion that people are free, and as a Black person I'm able to do whatever I want, but there's still a lot of systems in place that work to the detriment of me and other people who look like me in allegedly the freest country in the world. So,
but you don't live in a walled city that is effectively a prison, where you don't have a right of return and you don't have the right of electricity or water rights, or, I mean, we're talking about, not even second-class citizen, but literally third world citizenry is what the Israelis, who have been charged with the care of the Palestinian people by occupying their entire country and not allowing them to leave or return, are responsible for. And
right.
It is beyond frustrating that nobody ever really mentions that point, that occupiers mean that you are responsible, that they are liable for every one of those people that was murdered. Okay, not just for murdering them, but they're responsible for the fact that they were supposed to make sure they didn't get murdered in the first place. Hello? What the fuck?
I'm just saying that what I said in terms of, like, granted, we went through slavery and Jim Crow, so you can almost make that. I think currently it would be like right now, like relatively what Palestinians are going to, I would argue, is worse in a way than what we kind of. I don't want to make this like the, oppression Olympics here. But however, you're right. Like, we weren't, at least currently, we're not in essentially an open air concentration camp. But still, it's the idea of like even navigating like life for me on the basis of my color of my skin. I'm at risk every single day.
Every time you walk out the apartment.
Right. And we're integrated now. So can you imagine still with the kind of propagandized thinking that Israelis have towards Arabs, and Arabs have been radicalized in the way because of their oppression, like to build a secular state, and obviously that's not going to happen like anytime soon, if at all. But to kind of go into like, so I think the article is basically saying there needs to be obviously a lot of care and intention in either having these alternative ideas even come in vogue. But our government is too lazy and too feckless to even want to do that.
Yep.
So it just shows how, I think that's really the point, is that people like our politicians are just so bought that they're not willing to do the hard work. And you could say that almost for anything else, like universal healthcare, like education, like housing. These are all big issues, but are worth the fight and like the intention and care to make it viable for people in order to live in true liberation. And what we end up getting is political gimmicks and crumbs in an attempt to avoid getting to the root causes of issues and actually doing the work that we need to do in order to see them come through. So I just kind of make that association in terms of here, like just with domestic stuff, and how like in foreign policy, even with this, we're seeing our leaders basically being like, two-state solution, that's the best we can do, because essentially it's too hard to offer up something better than that.
Fred Edward reminding us that pre-1948, Palestine was a secular state. Jews, Muslims, and Christians all live there. FFS. Yes, thank you.
Yes. Yes.
We could all live together in harmony too if we got some extra Kofi. Probably we could go live on the commune with Yeti up in Nova Scotia. They're living in a yurt, and they're literally homesteading and building everything from scratch. And so co-fi.com/indienewsnetwork is going to help us keep doing what we're doing here. We certainly need your support to pay the bills, keep the lights on, and maybe to do some really cool stuff like the Zago brothers, who I don't know if you saw Collin's profile pic on Twitter. I believe you changed it, or have you changed it already? Yep. Mm-hmm. So Zago brothers did some cartoon art for all the INN members, as well as all the Indie Media Award honorees. All right. So all of the money that we've been receiving has been going towards supporting the Zago brothers. Don't forget, please, also to do the things, the like, the subscribe, the share, regardless of what platform you're on, whether that is YouTube or that's Kick or Rumble or Twitch. We're still on Twitch. Hi, Twitch. What's up, Twitch? That purple little thing that nobody ever talks about or goes to. We're still there. Yeah, we're live on Twitch. And then we also upload stuff to Substack and INN Newsletter. So a shout out to INN Newsletter, where you can support all of those places. Please comment. Also, comments do matter. We read them. They matter to the algorithm. The more things that get commented on, the more comments the algorithm sees, the more important and the more popular it thinks that video is, and it pushes it to more of the subscribers at minimum. Right now, we're sitting at about close to 2,200 subscribers on YouTube, close to 1,000 on indienewsnetwork.com. That's totally free. You can subscribe to all those places. And as always, thanks for watching, fam.
Thank you. We love you.